The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the general store, sending up a cloud of dust that settled on Margaret Hayes's worn traveling dress. She clutched her small carpet bag tighter, her knuckles white beneath her thin gloves. At 32 years old, she was the oldest mail-order bride to arrive in Copper Creek, Montana territory, and she knew it. "Last stop, ma'am," the driver called down, his tone respectful but his eyes pitying. Margaret climbed down carefully, her legs stiff from 3 days of travel. The afternoon sun beat down on the small frontier town, painting everything in shades of gold and brown. A handful of wooden buildings lined the dusty main street, and beyond them, she could see the vast expanse of prairie stretching toward distant mountains. She'd come here because she had nowhere else to go. The advertisement had been specific: widow seeking companionship. No beauty required. Must be of good character and willing to work. It wasn't romantic, but Margaret had given up on romance years ago. What she needed was survival. The door to the general store opened, and a thin woman in her 60s stepped out, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. Her sharp eyes took in Margaret's appearance in one sweeping glance. "You must be the bride for old Tom Henderson," the woman said, her voice carrying across the street. Margaret's cheeks burned. Several townspeople had stopped to stare, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed amusement. She heard a young woman whisper to her companion, "That's the best Tom could do? Poor man must be desperate." "I'm Margaret Hayes," she said, lifting her chin. She'd endured worse than small-town gossip. "I'm here to meet Mr. Henderson." The shopkeeper's expression softened slightly. "I'm Mrs. Calloway. Tom should be here soon. You can wait inside, out of the sun." Before Margaret could respond, the sound of hoofbeats drew everyone's attention. A lone rider appeared at the end of the street, sitting tall in the saddle on a magnificent black horse. Even from a distance, Margaret could see he was a large man, broad-shouldered and commanding. "That's James Blackwood," Mrs. Calloway whispered, a note of reverence in her voice. "Owns the biggest ranch in 3 counties. Richest man in the territory, some say." Margaret watched as the rider approached. He was indeed massive, well over 6 feet tall, with dark hair visible beneath his hat. His face was weathered and stern, with a strong jaw shadowed by a day's growth of beard. He couldn't have been much older than 40, but there was something ancient in his eyes, something weary. James Blackwood rode past the general store, his gaze sweeping over the small crowd. For just a moment, his dark eyes met Margaret's, and she felt a jolt run through her. Then he was past, dismounting in front of the bank with fluid grace despite his size. "He lost his wife 7 years ago," Mrs. Calloway continued, seemingly unable to help herself. "Beautiful young thing, died giving birth to their daughter. The baby lived, thank God, but Mr. Blackwood, well, he hasn't been the same since. Keeps to himself mostly, just him and little Sarah out at that big ranch." Margaret turned away, uninterested in the town's richest resident. Men like James Blackwood didn't notice women like her. She'd learned that lesson well enough in her youth, before her brief marriage to Samuel Hayes, before his death from fever had left her alone and nearly penniless. "There's Tom now," Mrs. Calloway said, pointing to an elderly man making his way slowly down the boardwalk. Margaret's heart sank. Tom Henderson had to be at least 70, bent with age, and walking with a cane. His letters had mentioned being a widower, but had been vague about his age. She understood now why he'd been so willing to pay her travel expenses without even seeing her photograph. Tom reached them and removed his hat, revealing a mostly bald head ringed with white hair. His smile was kind, but his hands trembled slightly. "Miss Hayes, I'm Tom Henderson. It's a pleasure to finally meet you." Margaret forced a smile. "Mr. Henderson, thank you for this opportunity." "Last resort meeting, last resort," someone muttered from the crowd, followed by muffled laughter. Tom's face flushed with anger, but before he could speak, a deep voice cut through the air like a knife. "That's enough!" James Blackwood had returned, standing at the edge of the boardwalk. He wasn't shouting, but his voice carried absolute authority. The crowd fell silent immediately. "This lady has traveled a long way," he continued, his dark eyes sweeping over the townspeople. "She deserves better than to be the subject of your entertainment. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me." Nobody spoke. James Blackwood's gaze lingered on Margaret for a moment longer than necessary. something unreadable in his expression. Then he turned and walked into the general store, the door closing firmly behind him. "Well," Tom said quietly, "that was unexpected. James doesn't usually involve himself in town matters." He offered Margaret his arm. "Shall we go to the hotel? I thought we could talk over supper, get to know each other before we make any final decisions." Margaret took his arm, grateful for his kindness if nothing else. As they walked away, she couldn't help but glance back at the general store, wondering about the man who defended a stranger. That evening, Margaret sat across from Tom Henderson in the hotel's small dining room. He'd been nothing but gentlemanly, and as they talked, she realized he was lonely more than anything else. His wife had died 2 years ago, his children had moved back east, and he simply didn't want to face his remaining years alone. "I won't lie to you, Miss Hayes," Tom said, pushing his barely touched food around his plate. "I'm not well. The doctor says my heart is weak. I might have a few years left or a few months. I'm not looking for romance or anything intimate. I just want someone to talk to in the evenings, someone to share meals with, and in return, I can offer you security. My house, my savings, everything would be yours when I pass." Margaret's throat tightened. It was honest, at least, practical, everything her life had become. "I understand, Mr. Henderson, and I appreciate your candor. Please, call me Tom." He smiled sadly. "We might as well be friends if nothing else. What do you say? Will you stay?" Before Margaret could answer, the dining room door opened, and James Blackwood entered with a little girl clutching his hand. The child couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, with dark curls and huge brown eyes that seemed too solemn for her age. Tom straightened in his chair. "James! And young Sarah, what brings you to town?" James removed his hat, and Margaret noticed how his large hand completely engulfed his daughter's small one. Sarah needed new shoes. "We're staying overnight at the hotel." His eyes found Margaret's again, and she felt that same strange current of awareness. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, probably in his late 30s. Lines of grief and weariness were etched around his eyes and mouth, but his features were strong and handsome in a rough-hewn way. "This is Miss Margaret Hayes," Tom said. "She just arrived today. Margaret, this is James Blackwood and his daughter Sarah." "Do, ma'am," James said, his voice a low rumble. Sarah peeked out from behind her father's leg, saying nothing. "It's a pleasure to meet you both," Margaret said softly. She smiled at the little girl. "What a pretty dress you have, Sarah." The child's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't speak, just pressed closer to her father. "She doesn't talk much," James said, a note of pain in his voice. "Not since, well, not for a long time." Margaret's heart squeezed. She knew what it was like to carry grief, to have it steal your voice. Tom cleared his throat. "James, I was just discussing with Miss Hayes the possibility of her staying in Copper Creek as my wife." Something flickered in James's expression, too quick for Margaret to read. "I see. Well, Tom's a good man, Miss Hayes. You could do worse." "I know," Margaret said, though she wasn't sure why she felt the need to explain herself to this stranger. "Mr. Henderson has been very kind." "Papa, I'm hungry," Sarah whispered, tugging on her father's sleeve. "Of course, sweetheart, let's get you some supper." James nodded to them both. "Tom, Miss Hayes." As they walked away to another table, Margaret couldn't help but watch them. James ordered for his daughter with gentle patience, cutting her meat into small pieces and encouraging her to eat. For such a large, imposing man, he was surprisingly tender with the child. "He's a good father," Tom observed, following her gaze. "Sarah is his whole world. It's a shame, really. A man like that alone, but he won't even consider remarrying. Says he had his chance at love and lost it." Margaret understood that sentiment all too well. She turned back to Tom, pushing thoughts of James Blackwood firmly from her mind. "I'll stay," she said quietly. "If you'll still have me, Tom, I'll stay." Tom's face lit up with relief and gratitude. "Thank you, my dear. You've made an old man very happy." They decided to marry in a week's time, giving Margaret a chance to settle in and make sure she was comfortable with the arrangement. Tom set her up in a room at the boarding house run by Mrs. Calloway's sister, a cheerful widow named Agnes Porter. Over the next few days, Margaret tried to find her place in Copper Creek. The town was small, and news of the last resort bride had spread quickly. Some of the women were kind, like Agnes, and eventually Mrs. Calloway. Others whispered behind their hands and looked at Margaret with pity or disdain. She tried not to let it bother her. She'd faced worse in her life. On her third day in town, Margaret was helping Agnes in the garden when a familiar deep voice called out, "Mrs. Porter." Margaret looked up to see James Blackwood standing at the garden gate, his hat in his hands. Sarah stood beside him, wearing a new pair of shoes that looked stiff and uncomfortable. "Mr. Blackwood," Agnes exclaimed, brushing dirt from her apron, "what can I do for you? I was wondering if you knew anyone in town who might be willing to help out at my ranch. I need someone to help with Sarah during the day, maybe teach her some reading and arithmetic, help with meals." He paused, his jaw tight. "The housekeeper I had quit last week said it was too isolated out there, too quiet." Agnes frowned thoughtfully. "Most of the young women in town are already working or have families of their own. Let me think. I could do it," Margaret heard herself say. Both Agnes and James turned to stare at her. She straightened, meeting James's dark gaze directly. "I don't marry Tom until the end of the week," she continued. "And even then, Tom mentioned he wouldn't mind if I kept myself occupied during the day. He naps quite a bit due to his heart. I taught school back in Ohio before I married. I know my letters and numbers." James studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Margaret forced herself not to look away, even though her heart was pounding. "It's a hard ride out to the ranch," he said finally. "Nearly an hour by wagon, and like I said, it's isolated. Nothing but prairie and cattle for miles. I'm not afraid of isolation, Mr. Blackwood, or hard work. The pay wouldn't be much. Maybe enough for some pin money. I'm not doing it for the money." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Then why?" Margaret glanced at Sarah, who was watching her with those big, solemn eyes. "Because that little girl needs someone. And I need to be useful." Something in James's expression softened. "Just a fraction. Can you start tomorrow?" "Yes. I'll pick you up at dawn. Bring warm clothes. Mornings are cold." He settled his hat back on his head, took Sarah's hand, and left without another word. Agnes stared at Margaret with wide eyes. "Do you know what you just agreed to? Being alone with James Blackwood all day? The richest, most eligible bachelor in 3 counties? People will talk." "People are already talking," Margaret said, turning back to the garden, but her hands were shaking slightly as she picked up the trowel. "At least this way, I'll have something to do besides listen to them." The next morning, Margaret woke in the pre-dawn darkness, her stomach fluttering with nerves. She dressed in her most practical clothes, a simple brown dress and sturdy boots, and wrapped her mother's old shawl around her shoulders. James was waiting outside in a wagon when she emerged, the sky just beginning to lighten in the east. He climbed down to help her up, his large hands steady on her waist as he lifted her onto the seat as easily as if she weighed nothing. "Thank you," she murmured, settling her skirts. Sarah was bundled up between them, half asleep and leaning against her father's side. James tucked a blanket more securely around his daughter before taking up the reins. They rode in silence as the sun rose, painting the prairie in shades of pink and gold. The land was vast and beautiful in a stark way, endless grass rolling toward distant mountains. Margaret had never seen anything like it. "It's beautiful," she said softly. James glanced at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Most women from back east think it's desolate." "It is desolate, but that doesn't mean it can't be beautiful." He nodded slowly, something like approval in his expression. They fell back into comfortable silence, broken only by the creak of the wagon and the morning songs of meadowlarks. The Blackwood Ranch appeared on the horizon after about an hour, and Margaret caught her breath. It was enormous, a large main house built of timber and stone, surrounded by well-maintained barns, corrals, and outbuildings. Cattle dotted the hills in every direction. "This is impressive, Mr. Blackwood. Call me James. We're going to be working together." He drove the wagon up to the main house. "I built most of it myself, planned to fill it with children." The pain in his voice was unmistakable. Margaret didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. James helped her down, then lifted Sarah into his arms. The little girl had fallen back asleep, her head on her father's broad shoulder. "Let me show you around," he said quietly. The inside of the house was as impressive as the outside. The main room had a large stone fireplace, comfortable furniture, and windows that looked out over the prairie. Everything was well made but showed signs of neglect: dust on the mantel, curtains that needed washing, floors that could use a good scrubbing. James carried Sarah upstairs to her room, A cozy space, with a small bed and toys that looked barely used. He laid her down gently, removing her shoes and covering her with a quilt. "She'll sleep another hour or so," he said, leading Margaret back downstairs. "She doesn't sleep well at night, so mornings are hard for her." "Nightmares?" Margaret asked gently. He nodded, his jaw tight. "She was there when her mother died. Only a baby, but I think she remembers somehow." Margaret's heart broke for both of them. "I'm sorry. It's been 7 years. I should be over it by now." "Grief doesn't work on a schedule, James." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. There was something intense in his gaze. "Searching." "No," he said finally. "I suppose it doesn't." He showed her the kitchen, well stocked but disorganized. The housekeeper who'd quit had left everything in a state. Margaret rolled up her sleeves. "Why don't you show me what needs to be done, and I'll get started?" James blinked. "You just got here. Don't you want to rest?" "I'm not fragile, James. Put me to work." Over the next few hours, Margaret learned the rhythms of the ranch. James went out to work with his men, checking on cattle and repairing fences. Sarah woke up and came downstairs, watching Margaret with cautious curiosity as she cleaned the kitchen and started bread dough. "Would you like to help me?" Margaret asked, keeping her voice soft and non-threatening. Sarah nodded slowly. Margaret found her a stool and showed her how to knead dough, her small hands working alongside Margaret's. They didn't talk much. Sarah still wouldn't speak, but there was a comfortable peace in the shared work. When James came back for lunch, he stopped in the doorway of the kitchen, staring. The room was clean, bread was baking in the oven, and Sarah was sitting at the table, carefully practicing her letters on a slate Margaret had found. "Is that Sarah?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Actually sitting still, actually learning," Margaret smiled. "She's a very bright girl. She just needed someone to pay attention to her." James crossed the room in 3 long strides. For a moment, Margaret thought he might hug her, but he stopped himself, his hands flexing at his sides. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You have no idea what this means to me." Their eyes met and held. Margaret felt that current of awareness again, stronger this time. James was standing close enough that she could smell him. Leather and sage and something uniquely male. He was so tall, she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "Papa," Sarah said suddenly, breaking the spell. "Look what I wrote." James stepped back, clearing his throat. "Let me see, sweetheart." Margaret busied herself with setting out lunch, trying to calm her racing heart. This was dangerous, she realized. Whatever this was between her and James, it couldn't happen. She was engaged to Tom Henderson, and James Blackwood was so far out of her reach, he might as well be on the moon. But as they sat down to eat together, Sarah chattering softly to her father about what she'd learned that morning, Margaret couldn't help but feel a sense of rightness, as if this was where she was meant to be. The days fell into a pattern. James would pick Margaret up at dawn. They'd ride out to the ranch together, and she'd spend the day teaching Sarah and keeping house while James worked. In the evenings, he'd drive her back to town, and they'd talk during the ride, about books they'd read, places they'd been, dreams they'd once had. Margaret learned that James had come west as a young man with nothing but determination and a strong back. He'd built his ranch through sheer force of will, proving everyone who doubted him wrong. He'd married at 28, finally able to support a wife, and for 3 years he'd been happy. Catherine was beautiful, he told Margaret one evening as the wagon rolled through the twilight. Young and full of life. I thought I was the luckiest man alive. You loved her very much. I did, but love wasn't enough to save her. His hands tightened on the reins. The baby was breech. The doctor couldn't turn her. Catherine bled out before dawn. I held her hand and watched her die, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. Margaret reached out without thinking and placed her hand over his. "I'm sorry." James stared at their joined hands, his throat working. "I swore I'd never put myself through that again. Never care that much about someone. It hurts too much to lose them, so you've been alone ever since." Alone is safer. Margaret understood that. She withdrew her hand, folding both in her lap. "I felt the same way after Samuel died. It wasn't the grand love story that yours was, but I cared for him. When the fever took him, I thought I'd never risk my heart again. But you're marrying Tom. That's different. Tom and I both know what we're getting into. It's a practical arrangement. Nothing more. James was quiet for a long moment. And that's enough for you. A practical arrangement. Margaret thought about her answer carefully. A month ago, she would have said yes without hesitation. But something had changed. Spending her days at the ranch, teaching Sarah, sharing meals with James, laughing at his dry humor and seeing the gentleness beneath his stern exterior, it had awakened something in her she thought long dead. It has to be enough, she said finally. Women like me don't get fairy tales, James. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the boarding house, but didn't help her down immediately. In the gathering darkness, his eyes were shadowed and unreadable. Women like you know what I mean. I'm 32 years old. I'm not pretty. I have nothing to offer but hard work and a practical nature. Tom is getting exactly what he paid for, a last resort bride. That's not true, James said, his voice low and intense. You're kind and smart and good with Sarah. You make my house feel like a home again. He stopped himself, jaw clenching. Margaret's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. I'm what? She whispered. James looked away. Nothing. Forget I said anything. I'll see you tomorrow morning. He helped her down, his hands lingering on her waist just a moment too long. Then he climbed back onto the wagon and drove away without looking back. Margaret stood in the darkness, her whole body trembling. She was in trouble, deep, dangerous trouble, because she was falling in love with James Blackwood. The wedding was set for Saturday. Tom had invited the whole town to a small reception at the hotel, wanting to do things properly despite the unconventional nature of their arrangement. Margaret spent her evenings that week helping Agnes prepare food and making sure her best dress was clean and pressed. And every morning, James picked her up at dawn, and they rode out to the ranch together. Neither of them spoke about what James had almost said that night. They kept their conversation light, focused on Sarah's progress or ranch business, but the tension between them grew stronger every day. On Thursday evening, 2 days before the wedding, James was quieter than usual during the ride back to town. Sarah had fallen asleep between them, and the silence felt heavy. Margaret, James said finally, his voice rough, I need to tell you something. Her heart leaped into her throat. What is it? He pulled the wagon off the main road, stopping in a grove of cottonwood trees. The setting sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows across his face. This is wrong, he said. All of it. You marrying Tom when... He stopped, running a hand through his dark hair. When I can't stop thinking about you. Margaret's breath caught. James, I know I have no right. You have an agreement with Tom, and I'm just a widower with too much land, and not enough sense to know when to keep my mouth shut. But Margaret, these past 2 weeks with you, they've been the best I've had in 7 years. You've brought light back into my house, into my life, into Sarah's life. Please don't, Margaret whispered, tears stinging her eyes. You're making this harder than it has to be. Harder? Margaret, you're about to marry a man you don't love. A man who, by his own admission, might not even live out the year. Is that really what you want? What I want doesn't matter. It matters to me. The words hung in the air between them. Sarah stirred but didn't wake. James reached out and took Margaret's hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. I know I'm being selfish. I know I swore I'd never do this again. But Margaret, I think I'm falling in love with you. Tears spilled down her cheeks. You can't love me. I'm nobody. I'm the last resort bride, remember. The woman no one else wanted. You're the woman I want, James said fiercely. The only woman I've wanted in 7 years. You're beautiful and kind and strong. You make Sarah smile. You make me smile. And if you marry Tom on Saturday, I think it might kill me. Margaret was sobbing now, her whole body shaking. What are you asking me to do? Break my promise to Tom? Hurt a kind old man who's shown me nothing but respect? Throw away my only chance at security for what? A maybe. For a chance at something real, James said. He cupped her face in his large hand, his thumb wiping away her tears. For a chance at love, at a family, at happiness. And what if it doesn't work? What if you realize I'm not enough? What if... Margaret, his voice was gentle but firm. Look at me. She raised her tear-filled eyes to his. You are enough, he said. More than enough. You're everything I didn't know I was looking for, and I know I'm asking a lot. I know I'm asking you to take a leap of faith, but I promise you, if you give me a chance, I will spend every day of the rest of my life proving to you that you made the right choice. James, she whispered, I'm scared. So am I. But I'm more scared of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I'd had the courage to fight for you. He leaned closer, and Margaret's breath stopped. His lips brushed hers, soft and questioning. She could have pulled away. She should have pulled away. Instead, she kissed him back. It was gentle at first, tentative, both of them afraid to push too hard. But then James's hand slid into her hair, and Margaret's arms went around his neck, and the kiss deepened into something desperate and yearning. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. Don't marry Tom, he whispered. Marry me instead. Margaret's mind was spinning. This was crazy, impossible. She couldn't just break her engagement to Tom and marry James Blackwood, could she? I need time to think, she managed to say. It's a lot, James nodded, pulling back reluctantly. I understand, but Margaret, please think about it seriously, about what you really want, not what you think you deserve, because you deserve everything. You deserve to be loved. He drove her back to town in silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. When he helped her down in front of the boarding house, his hands lingered on her waist. Whatever you decide, he said quietly, I meant what I said. You're not nobody to me. You're everything. Margaret watched him drive away, her heart in turmoil. Agnes was waiting in the parlour when she came inside. You've been crying, the older woman observed. What happened? Margaret sank into a chair and told her everything. Agnes listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful. So, what are you going to do? She asked when Margaret finished. I don't know. Tom has been so kind to me. I can't just... Margaret, dear, can I tell you something? Agnes sat forward. Tom is my friend, has been for 20 years, and I can tell you right now, he doesn't want a wife who's settling for him out of obligation. But he needs someone. He needs a companion, yes, but he doesn't need a wife who's in love with another man. That wouldn't be fair to anyone, least of all you. Margaret stared at her hands. What if James changes his mind? What if he realizes he made a mistake? What if he doesn't? What if this is your chance at real happiness and you're too afraid to take it? Margaret spent a sleepless night wrestling with her decision. By morning, she knew what she had to do. She found Tom at breakfast at the hotel. He took one look at her face and sighed. It's James, isn't it? He said quietly. Margaret's eyes widened. How did you... I'm old, my dear, not blind. I've seen the way he looks at you, the way you look at him. Tom reached across the table and patted her hand. It's all right, truly. Tom, I'm so sorry. You've been nothing but kind to me, and I feel like I'm betraying you. Nonsense. If anything, I'm relieved. He smiled gently. I'll confess something to you, Margaret. When I placed that advertisement, I was looking for someone to keep me company in my final days. But after meeting you, after seeing how alive you are, how much you have to offer, I realized I couldn't do that to you, couldn't trap you in a marriage of convenience when you deserve so much more. You're too good, Margaret whispered. I'm practical, and I can see that you and James could be good for each other. He needs someone to bring him back to life. You need someone to cherish you the way you deserve. I think you're a perfect match. Margaret hugged him, tears streaming down her face. Thank you. Thank you for understanding. Will you do one thing for me? Tom asked. Be happy. That's all I ever wanted for you. As soon as she left Tom, Margaret borrowed a horse from the livery and rode out to the Blackwood ranch. It was mid-morning, and she found James in the corral, working with a young horse. He looked up when he heard the horse approaching, his eyes widening when he saw her. Margaret! He vaulted over the fence with surprising grace for such a large man. What are you doing here? Where's the wagon? She slid down from the saddle, her legs shaking. I talked to Tom. James went very still. And I told him I couldn't marry him because I'm in love with someone else. Hope flared in James's eyes, raw and vulnerable. Margaret, I'm scared, she interrupted. I'm terrified, actually. This could all go wrong. You could change your mind. I could disappoint you, but Agnes asked me something last night. She asked what if I'm too afraid to take my chance at real happiness, and I realized I'm more afraid of never knowing what we could be together. James crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and swept her into his arms. Margaret gasped at suddenly being lifted off her feet, her hands clutching his shoulders. "Say it again," he demanded, his voice rough with emotion. "I love you," Margaret said, looking into his dark eyes. "I love you, James Blackwood, even though you're stubborn and brooding and—" He kissed her, cutting off her words. It was different from the kiss in the wagon, fiercer, more certain, a claiming and a promise all at once. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, James set her carefully back on her feet, his large hands cradling her face. "Marry me," he said, "not because you need security, not because you have nowhere else to go. Marry me because I love you, and I want to spend every day of the rest of my life making you happy." "Yes," Margaret whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." James kissed her again, and Margaret heard a small sound of delight. They broke apart to find Sarah standing in the doorway of the barn, a huge smile on her little face. "Sarah, sweetheart," James called. "Come here." The little girl ran to them, and James scooped her up with one arm, keeping the other around Margaret. "How would you like it if Margaret came to live with us?" he asked his daughter. "If she became your mama?" Sarah looked at Margaret with those big brown eyes, and then, for the first time since Margaret had met her, the little girl spoke. "Yes, please," she whispered. Margaret burst into tears again, but this time they were tears of joy. James pulled them both close, and for the first time in 7 years, his heart felt whole. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Copper Creek. Tom walked Margaret down the aisle, beaming with pride. Sarah stood as flower girl, tossing petals with solemn concentration. Agnes cried happy tears, and even Mrs. Calloway admitted it was the most romantic wedding the town had ever seen. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, James kissed Margaret thoroughly, earning cheers and whistles from the assembled crowd. Margaret blushed, but she was smiling, truly smiling, for the first time in years. At the reception, several of the women who'd gossiped about Margaret apologized, admitting they'd been wrong to judge her. Margaret forgave them graciously, too happy to hold grudges. "So the last resort bride caught the richest man in 3 counties, one woman said, shaking her head in wonder. "How did you do it?" Margaret looked across the room at James, who was holding Sarah and watching her with such love in his eyes it made her heart ache. "I didn't do anything," she said honestly. "I just showed up and was myself, and it turned out that was enough." That night, James carried Margaret over the threshold of their home, truly their home now. Sarah was already asleep upstairs, exhausted from the excitement of the day. "Alone at last," James murmured, setting Margaret down carefully in the main room. "Nervous?" Margaret asked, her heart racing. "Terrified," he admitted. "It's been 7 years since I was with a woman, and I want everything to be perfect for you." Margaret reached up and cupped his face, feeling the scratch of his beard against her palms. "James, just being here with you is perfect. We have all the time in the world to figure out the rest." He pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "I love you, Margaret Blackwood. I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "I love you too," she whispered against his chest, "even though you're too tall, and I'm going to get a crick in my neck from kissing you." James laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. "I'll make sure to bend down more often." He did bend down, capturing her lips in a kiss that quickly grew heated. His hands spanned her waist, and Margaret marveled at how easily he could lift her, how strong yet gentle he was. "Bedroom?" he asked against her mouth. "Bedroom," she agreed breathlessly. James swept her into his arms and carried her up the stairs, Margaret giggling like a girl. He set her down in the master bedroom, their bedroom now, and lit the lamp with shaking hands. In the soft golden light, they undressed each other slowly, reverently. James's hands trembled as he unlaced her dress, his breath catching when the fabric fell away. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice rough with wonder and desire. Margaret had never felt beautiful before, but in James's eyes, in the way he touched her with such care and passion, she believed it. Their lovemaking was tender and awkward and perfect all at once. James was patient, attentive to her needs, and when they finally came together completely, Margaret felt tears slide down her temples. "Did I hurt you?" James asked immediately, freezing above her. "No," she managed, pulling him down for a kiss. Happy tears. I'm just so happy. James made love to her slowly, thoroughly, whispering words of love and devotion against her skin. And when they finally collapsed together, tangled in sheets and each other, Margaret knew she was finally, truly home. In the months that followed, Margaret settled into her new life with a contentment she'd never known. Sarah began speaking more every day, calling Margaret Mama without hesitation. The ranch prospered under James's careful management, and Margaret turned the house into a warm, welcoming home. The town gradually stopped seeing her as the last resort bride and started seeing her as what she'd become, James Blackwood's wife, Sarah's mother, and a valued member of the community. But it was the quiet moments Margaret treasured most. The mornings when James would pull her close before they got out of bed, kissing her slowly and thoroughly. The evenings when they'd sit by the fire while Sarah played at their feet, perfectly content. The nights when James would hold her and whisper how grateful he was that she'd taken a chance on him. Winter came to Montana Territory with a vengeance that first year of their marriage. Snow piled up against the barn doors, and the wind howled across the prairie like a living thing. Margaret had never experienced cold like this, but she found she didn't mind it. Not when James would wrap her in his arms at night, sharing his warmth. Not when they'd all huddle by the fire together, Sarah between them, listening to James tell stories of his early days on the frontier. "Tell the one about the bear again, Papa," Sarah would beg, her eyes wide. James would launch into the tale, his deep voice painting pictures of adventure and danger. Margaret would watch him, marveling at how different he was now from the stern, silent man she'd first met. Love had opened him up, brought back the man he'd been before grief had closed him off from the world. One particularly harsh evening in January, a blizzard struck with such fury that James couldn't make it back to the house from the barn. Margaret paced by the window, her heart in her throat, until she finally saw his tall form emerging from the white curtain of snow. He stumbled through the door, covered in ice and snow, his face red from the cold. Margaret rushed to him, helping him out of his frozen coat. "I was so worried," she said, her hands shaking as she worked at the buttons. "I'm fine," James assured her, though his teeth were chattering. The horses needed tending, couldn't leave them in this. "You stubborn man," Margaret scolded, but her voice was gentle. "You could have frozen to death out there." "Not when I have you waiting for me," he said, pulling her close despite his frozen clothes. "I'd fight through any storm to get back to you." Margaret heated water for him to wash with and made him sit by the fire with hot coffee laced with whiskey. Sarah brought him her favorite blanket, draping it over his shoulders with solemn care. "Don't scare us like that again, Papa," she said softly. James pulled his daughter onto his lap, then reached for Margaret's hand, pulling her down to sit beside them. "I'm sorry, my girls. I promise to be more careful." They sat together like that until the fire burned low and Sarah fell asleep in her father's arms. James carried her upstairs to bed, then returned to find Margaret banking the fire for the night. "Come to bed," he said, his voice low and rough, in a way that made heat pool in Margaret's stomach despite the cold. In their room, James undressed her slowly, his large hands reverent on her skin. Even after months of marriage, he still touched her like she was something precious, something to be cherished. "I meant what I said earlier," he murmured against her neck. "I'd fight through any storm to get back to you. Do you know why?" "Why?" Margaret breathed, her fingers threading through his dark hair. "Because you're my home, Margaret. Not this house, not this ranch. You, wherever you are, that's where I belong." He made love to her slowly that night, with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Margaret traced patterns on his chest. "James, can I ask you something?" "Anything." Do you ever think about Catherine, about your first marriage?" She felt him tense slightly, then relax. A few months ago, the question might have caused him to withdraw, but they'd built something strong enough to weather difficult conversations. "Sometimes," he admitted, "especially when I look at Sarah and see Catherine's eyes looking back at me, But Margaret, what I feel for you, it's not less than what I felt for her. It's just different. I loved Catherine with all the passion and idealism of a young man. What I feel for you is deeper, richer. It's built on friendship and respect and genuine partnership. I'm not jealous of her memory, Margaret said softly. I just want to make sure I'm not replacing her. James rolled over, propping himself up on one elbow to look down at her. You're not replacing anyone. You're writing your own chapter in my life, in Sarah's life, and it's the best chapter I could have hoped for. He kissed her then, deep and thorough, showing her with his body what words couldn't quite express. Spring came eventually, as it always did, turning the prairie into a sea of wildflowers. Margaret discovered she was with child on a warm April morning, and she spent the whole day trying to figure out how to tell James. She finally decided to let Sarah help her. That evening, when James came in from checking the fence lines, he found the table set with their best dishes and candles lit. "What's the occasion?" he asked, hanging up his hat. "We have news, Papa," Sarah announced, practically bouncing with excitement. James looked between his daughter and his wife, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Margaret?" She nodded, tears of joy streaming down her face. "I'm going to have a baby. We're going to have a baby." James crossed the room in 2 strides and swept her into his arms, spinning her around. "A baby," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "We're having a baby." He set her down carefully, as if she were made of glass, his hands going to her still flat stomach. "When?" "October, the doctor thinks." "October." James shook his head in wonder, then dropped to his knees, pressing his face against her stomach. "I'm going to be a father again." Sarah joined them, wrapping her arms around both her parents. "I'm going to be a big sister." That night, after Sarah was asleep, James held Margaret close, his hand resting protectively over her stomach. "I'm scared," he admitted quietly. "After what happened with Catherine." "I know," Margaret said, covering his hand with hers. "But I'm strong, James. And Dr. Morrison says I'm healthy. He sees no reason why everything shouldn't go smoothly." "I couldn't survive losing you," James said, his voice breaking. "You and Sarah. You're my whole world." "You're not going to lose me," Margaret promised. "I'm not going anywhere." But as summer wore on and Margaret's belly grew round, James's anxiety grew with it. He became overprotective, insisting she rest constantly, forbidding her from any heavy work. Margaret understood his fear, but found his hovering frustrating. "James, I'm pregnant, not dying," she said one afternoon, when he'd insisted she sit down after she'd been on her feet for all of 10 minutes. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "Not my wife," James said stubbornly. "My wife is going to take it easy and not take any risks." Margaret sighed, but gave in, recognizing the terror beneath his protectiveness. She let him fuss over her, let him carry her upstairs even though she was perfectly capable of walking, let him worry himself sick every time she had the slightest twinge. Tom Henderson visited often that summer, delighted by the news of the coming baby. He'd become a good friend to both of them, often joining them for Sunday dinners. "You look beautiful," he told Margaret one afternoon as they sat on the porch while James and Sarah played in the yard. "Happiness suits you." "I am happy," Margaret said, watching her husband chase their daughter around the garden, his deep laugh carrying on the warm breeze. "Happier than I ever thought possible." "I'm glad," Tom said sincerely. "You know, when you first arrived in Copper Creek, I thought I was doing you a favor by offering you security. Turns out you were doing me the favor by refusing. Watching you and James together, seeing the family you've built, it reminds me what real love looks like." Margaret squeezed his hand. "You're a good man, Tom Henderson, and you're proof that sometimes the best things in life come when we least expect them." As fall approached and Margaret's time drew near, James became almost unbearable in his worry. He barely left her side, checking on her constantly, jumping at every sound she made. "James," Margaret said one evening when he'd asked for the 10th time if she was feeling all right, "you need to calm down. This stress isn't good for either of us." "I can't help it," he said, running his hands through his hair. "Every time I close my eyes, I see—" "I know what you see," Margaret interrupted gently. "But James, I'm not Catherine, and this baby isn't that baby. You need to trust that everything is going to be fine." "How can you be so calm?" "Because I have faith in my body, in Dr. Morrison, in God, and in you. I know that no matter what happens, you'll be there for me." James pulled her into his arms, careful of her swollen belly. "Always. I'll always be there for you." Margaret went into labor on a cool October evening. The pains started during supper, and James immediately went pale. "It's starting," Margaret said, gripping the edge of the table as a contraction rolled through her. "I'll get the doctor," James said, already moving toward the door. "James, wait. There's time. The pains are still far apart. Send one of the ranch hands for Dr. Morrison. But you stay with me." James did as she asked, though his hands were shaking when he returned. Sarah, sensing the importance of the moment, was unusually quiet, helping where she could and staying close to her mother. Dr. Morrison arrived within the hour and examined Margaret. "Everything looks good, Mrs. Blackwood. Probably have a baby by morning." The night was long and difficult. Margaret had thought she understood pain, but labor was something else entirely. James stayed by her side through all of it, holding her hand, wiping her brow, whispering encouragement. "You're doing so well," he kept saying. "So strong, so brave." "I don't feel strong," Margaret gasped between contractions. "You're the strongest woman I know," James said fiercely. "You can do this." As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Margaret felt the overwhelming urge to push. Dr. Morrison positioned himself at the foot of the bed. "All right, Mrs. Blackwood. On the next contraction, I want you to push as hard as you can." James supported her shoulders, his face a mask of terror and hope. Margaret bore down, pushing with all her strength. "Again," Dr. Morrison encouraged. "I can see the head. One more good push." Margaret gathered every ounce of strength she had left and pushed. There was a moment of searing pain, and then suddenly, blessedly, relief. A baby's cry filled the room. "It's a boy," Dr. Morrison announced, holding up a squirming, red-faced infant. A healthy baby boy. James was crying, tears streaming down his face as the doctor placed the baby in Margaret's arms. She looked down at their son, perfect and beautiful, and felt her heart overflow. "He's perfect," she whispered. "You're perfect," James said, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "Thank you. Thank you for giving me this, for being so strong, for surviving." Sarah crept into the room, her eyes huge. "Is that my brother?" "Come meet him," Margaret said softly. Sarah climbed carefully onto the bed, peering at the tiny baby. "He's so small. What's his name?" Margaret and James looked at each other. They discussed names, but hadn't made a final decision. "Samuel," Margaret said suddenly. "After my first husband. He was a good man, and he deserved to be remembered." James nodded, understanding the gift she was giving to her past. "Samuel James Blackwood. Can I hold him?" Sarah asked. James helped Sarah position her arms, then carefully placed the baby in them. The sight of his daughter holding his son nearly undid him. His family, whole and healthy. And here, Dr. Morrison finished his examination of Margaret, pronounced her in excellent health, and left with a promise to check on them the next day. James climbed into bed beside Margaret and Sarah, pulling all of them close. "My family," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "My whole world right here." The weeks that followed were exhausting and wonderful. Samuel was a good baby, but any baby required round-the-clock care. Margaret was grateful for Sarah's help and for James's unwavering support. He'd get up with her in the night, changing diapers and walking the floor with Samuel when he was fussy. "You don't have to do this," Margaret told him one night when she found him in the nursery at 2 a.m, Samuel asleep on his broad shoulder. "I want to," James said simply. "I missed so much with Sarah. I was so consumed by grief. I'm not missing a moment with Samuel." Winter came again, and the house was filled with warmth and life. Margaret would sit by the fire, nursing Samuel, while Sarah practiced her letters, and James worked on ranch accounts. They were a family in every sense of the word. One evening in late December, as snow fell softly outside, there was a knock at the door. James answered it to find Agnes Porter and Mrs. Calloway standing there with baskets of food and wrapped packages. "We've come to meet the baby," Agnes announced, "and to bring Christmas cheer." Soon the house was filled with neighbors and friends. Tom was there, bouncing Samuel gently and looking happier than Margaret had seen him in months. Even some of the women who'd once gossiped about Margaret came, admitting they'd been wrong and asking to be friends. Margaret moved through the gathering, accepting congratulations and feeling genuinely welcomed for the first time. This was her community now. These were her people. Later, after everyone had left and the children were asleep, James found Margaret standing by the window, looking out at the snow-covered prairie lit by moonlight. "Happy?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Overwhelmingly so, she said, leaning back against him. 1.5 years ago, I arrived here as the last resort bride, the woman nobody wanted. And now look at me. I have a husband who loves me, 2 beautiful children, a home, friends. It's more than I ever dreamed possible. James turned her to face him, his dark eyes serious. You were never the last resort, Margaret. You were the answer to prayers I didn't even know I was praying. You brought light back into my life. You gave Sarah her voice back. You made me believe in love again. You did the same for me, Margaret said, reaching up to cup his face. You made me believe I was worthy of being loved, that I deserved happiness. You deserve everything, James said fiercely, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know it. He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, and upstairs, their children slept peacefully. The years passed in a beautiful blur. Samuel grew into a strong, curious boy who followed his father everywhere. Sarah blossomed into a confident young woman, eventually training to be a teacher herself. Margaret and James added 2 more children to their family, twin girls named Catherine and Elizabeth, honoring both James's first wife and Margaret's mother. The ranch prospered beyond anyone's expectations. James's reputation as a fair and honest rancher grew, and he became a leader in the territory. But no matter how busy he became, he always made time for his family, for morning kisses with Margaret, for teaching his son to rope cattle, for tea parties with his daughters. Margaret became known throughout the territory not as the last resort bride, but as one of the most respected women in Montana. She started a school in Copper Creek, teaching not just her own children but dozens of others. She organized charity drives for struggling families and became a voice for women's education. But her greatest joy was still the quiet moments at home, the evenings when James would find her in the kitchen and pull her into his arms, dancing to music only they could hear. The mornings when all 4 children would pile into their bed for cuddles. The nights when she and James would sit on the porch, watching the sun set over the prairie, his hand clasped in hers. Tom Henderson lived to see Samuel's first birthday, Margaret's second pregnancy, and the twins' births. He passed peacefully in his sleep one winter night, surrounded by the family he'd helped bring together. At his funeral, Margaret cried genuine tears for the kind old man who'd given her a chance when no one else would. He was a good man, James said, holding her as she wept. He was, Margaret agreed. He brought me here, to you, to this life. I'll always be grateful to him for that. On their 5th wedding anniversary, James took Margaret on a picnic to the spot where he'd first kissed her, under the cottonwood trees outside of town. The children were home with Agnes, giving them a rare afternoon alone. 5 years, James said, pouring her a glass of wine. Best 5 years of my life. Mine too, Margaret said, settling against his side. Though I have to say, I never imagined this when I stepped off that stagecoach. What did you imagine? Loneliness, a practical arrangement with Tom, a quiet, simple life, not this grand adventure. James laughed. You call 4 children and a cattle ranch a grand adventure? The grandest, Margaret said, turning to look at him. The years had been kind to James. There were more lines around his eyes now, some grey in his dark hair, but he was still the handsomest man she'd ever seen. Every day with you is an adventure. Even the boring days when all we do is change diapers and chase cattle. Especially those days. James kissed her, slow and deep, taking his time. When they broke apart, both breathing harder, his eyes were dark with desire. The children won't be expecting us back for hours, he murmured against her lips. James Blackwood, Margaret said, trying to sound scandalized but failing. Are you suggesting we be improper in broad daylight? I'm suggesting, he said, laying her back on the blanket, that I make love to my wife under the same trees where I first kissed her. Is that so wrong? Not wrong at all, Margaret breathed, pulling him down to her. They made love slowly, tenderly, celebrating 5 years of marriage and partnership and love. Afterward, they lay tangled together, watching clouds drift across the blue Montana sky. Margaret, James said quietly, do you ever regret it, choosing me instead of the safe, practical arrangement with Tom? She propped herself up on her elbow, looking down at him. Never, not for a single moment. This life with you, this family we've built, It's everything I never knew I wanted. Good, he said, pulling her down for another kiss, because I plan on keeping you for at least another 50 years. Only 50? Fine. Forever then. That's better. One evening when Sarah was 15, Samuel was 12, and the twins were 8, the whole family gathered around the dinner table. It had become their tradition to share one thing they were grateful for each day. I'm grateful for Mama teaching me to read, Catherine said. Now I can read any book I want. I'm grateful Papa let me help with the new foal, Elizabeth added. I'm grateful for food, Samuel said, already reaching for seconds. Everyone laughed. The boy had an appetite that seemed bottomless. I'm grateful for my family, Sarah said, smiling around the table. And for Mama. You gave me my voice back. I don't think I've ever told you how much that means to me. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Oh, sweetheart. I'm grateful for second chances, James said, his voice deep and sure. For the day Margaret stepped off that stagecoach and into our lives. All eyes turned to Margaret. She looked around the table at her family, her husband, her children, this life she'd built from nothing, and felt overwhelmed with love. I'm grateful for all of you, she said softly, for every moment of every day, for the journey that brought me here, and for the courage to take a chance on love when I thought I didn't deserve it. James reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb stroking over her knuckles. The look in his eyes made her heart race, even after all these years. That night, after the children were in bed, Margaret and James sat on the porch as they often did, watching the stars come out. Do you remember what you said to me that night in the wagon? Margaret asked. When you asked me not to marry Tom, I said a lot of things that night, most of them probably too forward. You said I deserved to be loved, that I deserved everything. I meant it. I know you did. And James, you've spent every day since then proving it to me, making me feel cherished and valued and loved. That's because you are all those things, James said, pulling her into his lap despite her protests that she was too heavy. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Margaret Blackwood, and I thank God every day that you were brave enough to choose love over safety. Margaret rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and sage and home. I love you, she whispered. I love you too, he said, his arms tightening around her, today and always. They sat like that until the moon rose high. Two people who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built something beautiful from broken pieces, who'd proven that it's never too late for a second chance at happiness. And if sometimes the people of Copper Creek still told the story of the last resort bride who married the richest cowboy in 3 counties, well, Margaret didn't mind. It was a good story after all. She just knew the truth of it, that she'd never been a last resort. She'd been exactly what James and Sarah needed, just as they'd been exactly what she needed. She'd been the missing piece that made their family whole, and that was the greatest gift of all. One warm summer evening, many years later, Margaret and James sat on their porch surrounded by their grandchildren. Sarah had married a good man and given them 3 grandchildren. Samuel was courting a sweet girl from town. The twins were growing into beautiful young women. Tell us the story, Grandmama, one of the grandchildren begged. Tell us how you and Grandpapa met. Margaret looked at James, and he smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He was grey now, and she had silver streaking through her hair, but the love between them burned as bright as ever. Well, Margaret began, it all started when everyone called me the last resort. Then, and as she told the story of how a lonely widow and a grieving widower found love in the most unexpected way, James held her hand, their fingers intertwined, just as their lives had become intertwined all those years ago. It was a story of second chances and new beginnings, of courage and faith and love that conquered fear. It was their story, and it was perfect. The end.